He put a smile on his face and walked over with her to where the rest of the wedding party was waiting for him. He managed to disengage himself from Amy when the photographer ordered the bridesmaids and groomsmen to opposite sides of the church garden. The groomsmen came back into the church just as the shuttle full of people arrived. Drew searched the crowd for Alexa, and when he finally saw her, laughing at something Dan's girlfriend said, his mouth dropped open. That red dress made him want to grab her hand, pull her out of the church, and bring her back to his hotel room immediately. Josh's cousin Bill walked up to her before he could get there. What the hell was he doing, looking at her like that? Apparently, her dress also made Drew want to tell every other man in this room that he wasn't allowed to look at her. Drew walked faster toward her ladies. He got to them just as Alexa was shaking Bill's hand. "May I escort you to your seats?" Bill smirked at him. "Sorry, Drew, I already claimed them." "You snooze, you lose." Drew narrowed his eyes at Bill and slid Alexa's arm into his. "Oh, Bill, you must have misunderstood. This one is mine." They walked down the aisle in silence for a few seconds. Once they were out of earshot, she murmured, "I'm sorry, did I interrupt a pissing contest? I can go back to the hotel, I don't want to be in the way." He laughed and drew her closer to him. "No, don't worry about it. And I won you anyway." She raised her eyebrows at him. "You won me," she said. He coughed. "Wait, that came out wrong. You aren't a thing to win, or whatever." "Sorry about that. It's just that dude always rubs me the wrong way." She smiled and held on to his arm tighter. "Well, I would much prefer that you win me than him, even though I am indeed not a thing to win, so I guess we agree there." He stood at the end of the pew with her, not wanting to let go quite yet. "Excuse us." Dan elbowed him aside to let Lauren into the pew. "Poor Bill." Alexa laughed up at him. Cock blocked on both sides. He didn't remember her looking this hot in the elevator. Good job, Thursday night Drew, for somehow knowing that she'd be this hot when she was shoeless sitting on the elevator floor. Oh wait, at that point he'd been trying not to stare at her cleavage, so maybe he had reason to know. "Whatever," he said. He needs to get his own girl and stop trying to grab someone else's. She went up on her tiptoes and kissed his cheek. "See you at the reception." She slid past him into the pew and sat down next to Lauren. "Save me a sandwich," he said, just to make her laugh. It worked. After the ceremony was over, Drew walked back down the aisle after Josh and Molly, with a pink chiffon-clad bridesmaid on his arm. He winked at Alexa as he walked by her, and she winked back. She and Lauren told wedding war stories on the shuttle ride to the hotel and placed bets on who in the wedding party would be wasted first. Lauren bet on Bill, but Alexa had money on Amy. When they got to the hotel, they followed the procession of guests up to the roof for cocktail hour and hung out in a corner with glasses of champagne and plates of something that looked very much like a fancy version of pigs in a blanket. Thank goodness she bonded with Lauren at the rehearsal dinner, otherwise, the ceremony and this part of the reception would have been awkward and lonely. She would have long ago sent dozens of SOS texts to Maddie. It was crucial to have another woman to laugh with, go to the bathroom with, and gossip with during a wedding. When Lauren was halfway through her How I Met Dan's story, Alexa realized what was coming and set her drink down on a nearby table. "Hold that thought," she said. "I have to use the ladies' room. Guard my drink." As soon as she walked into the hall, she pulled her phone out of her clutch. "Hey boyfriend, how did we meet? I can tell Lauren is about to ask me." Wanted to make sure our stories were straight. Just as she got into the bathroom, her clutch vibrated. "The elevator, but a month ago. I was in town for that conference, remember? Good plan." Keeping to the truth as much as possible was the best way to tell a lie. She'd learned that after working in politics for a while. Not that she made it a habit to tell lies, but when she had to, it was best that she knew how to do it believably. "We're so happy that the wedding was back at this same hotel, weren't we?" When she got back out to Lauren, there was another plate sitting next to her drink, along with Bill, the annoying usher. "Bill grabbed us some crab cakes," Lauren said. She raised her eyebrows at Alexa where Bill couldn't see her. This was also why it was crucial to have women friends at a wedding. You needed someone to roll your eyes with at all of the creepy dudes. Oh, thank goodness, This drink is starting to go to my head already. I don't want to be drunk by the time the bride and groom walk in. Thanks, Bill. My pleasure. What's your name again? Alice? He grinned at her, his eyes dropping to her cleavage. She drained her drink. Alexa. Alexa, it looks like you need another drink. He brushed some hair from her shoulder. She forced a smile. I do, thank you. Champagne, please. Lauren? After they sent Bill off to the bar, they both cringed and went back to their conversation. Okay, where were we? You reached for the last carton of eggs at the farmer's market and Dan picked them up? Alexa had finished 2 more crab cakes by the time Bill was back from the bar. He handed her the drink with a big smile, his eyes on her cleavage again, and his hand on her elbow. Nothing in the world would compel her to drink that glass of champagne. She moved her clutch from her right hand to her left to shift her body away from him, but he followed. This dude. He had about 5 seconds to back away before she'd accidentally spill the champagne on him. What about you and Drew? How did you two meet? Lauren asked Alexa. Well, an arm went around her waist. It was actually right here in this hotel. She turned her head, and Drew smiled down at her. Hey, she said. You guys are here. She moved closer to Drew and relaxed against him. Hey yourself. The rest of the room washed away, and it was just this dream of a guy in a tux, golden brown eyes, his fingers stroking her hip in that way that made her wish there wasn't a layer of clothes in between them and her skin. Oh God. She was fantasizing about him again. Where's Dan? Lauren asked, at the bar. We both need a drink after all of those pictures. Drew leaned down and his lips brushed her ear. You guys weren't having too much fun without us, were you? Just talking about you guys, Lauren said. Speaking of, I'll go meet Dan at the bar. I could use another drink, too. Alexa? Alexa nodded, only half listening to Lauren. She could stand there all night with Drew's arm around her and his fingers skimming her waist. She felt dizzy from the touch of his hands on her body and his eyes looking down at her. It was almost too much. Bill's hand tightened on her elbow. She'd forgotten he was even there. He smirked at Drew. I hope you don't mind me stealing your date, but what can I say? I got back to the reception faster. Drew pulled her closer to him and away from Bill. His fingers kept moving over Alexa's body, drawing circles up and down her waist, moving from there to the small of her back. Go away, Billy. The grown-ups are talking. He shooed Bill away with his fingers without taking his eyes off Alexa. After a few seconds, Bill walked away. Alexa smiled up at Drew and opened her mouth to thank him just as his grip on her waist relaxed. Oh. He'd only been holding on to her like that to protect her from Bill. That was nice of him. She took a step back, and his arm dropped away from her. She felt colder. And much more sober than a minute before. Thank you for that. Did you? I mean, how was everything with the wedding? Alexa asked him, crossing her arms in front of her chest and wishing she had that drink. He shrugged, his hands at his side. Mostly fine. Josh was so excited it was almost cute, Drew said, itching to touch her again. He had to keep reminding himself that she wasn't really his girlfriend, or even his real date. She hadn't signed up for him to be all over her tonight, even though he could barely keep his hands off her in that dress. Even though his blood pressure had skyrocketed the second he'd seen Bill with his hand on her. Want to go find Lauren and Dan now that we got rid of Bill? Now that you got rid of Bill, you mean? She smiled up at him, and it took everything he had not to pull her back against him. But she'd stepped away as soon as he'd relaxed his arm. She probably didn't want that. They walked together toward the bar, close but not touching. There you guys are. Dan said. Lauren and Dan met them halfway, each with 2 drinks in their hands. The bar is swamped, but Dan cut to the front of the line. Lauren said, please, take your drinks. People keep looking at us like we're lushes. Dan handed Alexa her drink. And I didn't cut. I'm a groomsman. We get front of the line privileges at the bar, didn't you know that? He laughed. Plus, I tip well. It's the only way to guarantee a heavy pour at an open bar. Oh, you guys were telling me the story of how you met, Lauren said. Oh good, now he had an excuse to touch Alexa, right here in this hotel, he said as he reached for her hand. We were stuck in the elevator for a while together, and she made me laugh the whole time, even though she openly refused to share the snacks in her purse with me. She interrupted. Okay, he says that like I was sitting there eating and ostentatiously not giving him any, which was not the case. He looked in my purse, without my permission, mind you, saw that I had snacks, and tried to sweet-talk me into giving them to him instead of to my sister. Probably the first time anyone has ever said no to our Drew. No wonder he was intrigued. Amy. Just who he needed right now, Alexa gave Amy one of those big, bright smiles like people gave toddlers. Amy, you certainly won the Maid of Honor lottery with that dress, didn't you? You all look so darling in that pale pink. Amy's eyes narrowed at the compliment. The night before, one of the bridesmaids had mentioned that Amy had pushed hard for black dresses, but Molly and their mom had insisted on pink, even though Amy claimed the color was juvenile and that it clashed with her hair. Drew squeezed Alexa's fingers since he couldn't laugh out loud. She squeezed back. Amy's hand was resting on the table right by Drew's. Was that her pinky finger rubbing against his? Yep, it was. He put his arm around Alexa to move closer to her and away from Amy. Your dress is great, too, Amy said to Alexa. I almost bought a dress like that for a wedding I went to last month, but I realized I was just too skinny for it. So glad you can make a dress like that work. Drew felt Alexa stiffen. He ran his hand up and down her back, not sure if he was trying to calm her or himself down. Probably both, because Amy's words had gotten his blood pressure up again. Thanks so much, Alexa said, lifting up her champagne glass and taking a sip. I always figure, if you've got them, flaunt them. She gestured to her breasts, causing him, and, he quickly realized, their whole group, to stare at them for a second. Okay, maybe longer than a second. When he eventually raised his eyes to hers, she smirked at him. He grinned back. Ladies and gentlemen, someone said over the microphone. Please welcome Josh and Molly Rogers. They all dutifully turned to the entryway and clapped as the bride and groom entered. Amy disappeared to the other side of the room, but he didn't move his hand from around Alexa, and she didn't move away this time. Okay, fine. She had to admit to herself that she was smitten with him. It was past time for talking sense into herself. At this point, she just had to ride it out for the rest of the night. She knew it was all fake, she knew because she'd been reminding herself of that, but it didn't matter. Not when he was touching her like that. At first, she'd tried to give him space. After Bill had moved away, Drew obviously hadn't wanted to keep up the pretense, so she'd backed away. But they told their real/fake story to Lauren and Dan, and he introduced her to a million people, and all of those things necessitated them holding hands at a minimum. Or so at least he seemed to think, and it's not like she was going to disagree with him there. So she kept her hand in his and her smile aimed at him, and boy did it feel good, fake or not. At dinner, they were at one end of the huge wedding party table, along with Amy, a few bridesmaids, and creepy Bill, with Lauren and Dan all the way at the far end. Well, at least she'd had lots of practice eating food with people who were hostile to her. She discovered tonight that working in politics had given her a lot of skills useful for being a pretend girlfriend. Drew was talking to Amy, who was on the other side of him, so Alexa chatted away with the bridesmaids sitting next to her, while they ate their entrees, pork chop encrusted with chopped almonds for her, chicken cordon bleu for him. He turned back to her while Amy complained to the waiter about something or other. How's your food? Good, actually, she said after swallowing. Better than your typical wedding food. Want some? She cut a piece and held out her fork to him. He recoiled. Was this too familiar for someone she'd just met 2 days before? Did he forget he was supposed to be her boyfriend in this scenario? Or maybe he hated sharing food. Whatever it was, it didn't make her feel great. Amy leaned around Drew to laugh at Alexa. You trying to kill Drew already? What did he do now? Alexa raised her eyebrows at Drew. Now she was pretty sure what the problem was, but she was interested to hear how he was going to play this one off. Oh. Drew leaned forward and put his hand on her shoulder. I guess this hasn't come up yet, but I'm allergic to nuts. He hated himself for that hurt feeling that had crossed her face before that very bright, and, he suspected, very fake, smile had flashed back on. He rubbed his hand down her arm, trying to apologize with his touch in the way he couldn't with words, not with all of these people listening. Weird, because that was one of the first things you told Molly, Amy said. I remember her telling me that. Was Amy actually suspicious, like he'd wondered last night? Or was she just being a bitch? Molly and I were in med school at the time. Things like that were more at the front of our minds. He turned halfway to Amy, his hand still on Alexa's arm. Alexa and I have been busy with other things, but I figured it would come up. And look, it has. The conversation around them moved on to how good the mashed potatoes were, Josh's stepfather's faux pas at the ceremony, whether people thought the DJ would be good or not. As soon as Amy pontificated loudly about how she'd told Molly to get a band instead, he moved his chair closer to Alexa and turned so his lips were almost against her ear. That was all my fault. I'm so sorry. Probably should have let you know about my deathly allergy before we ate a meal together. It's okay. He could hear the smile in her voice. Almost killing my date makes a wedding exciting. He laughed. Okay, good, she wasn't mad at him, no chance of that. We're surrounded by doctors, remember? I bet at least 10 people have EpiPens on them, just for kicks. Did she realize her hand was resting on his thigh? It was probably just because of the way he was sitting right against her so he could whisper. Her hand was probably on his thigh by default. He didn't care. He just wished there was a way to keep it there. Alexa, I'm heading to the ladies' room. Want to come with? He liked Dan's girlfriend, Lauren, but he could cheerfully kill her right now. Did she have any allergies? He watched Alexa as she crossed the room, laughing about something or other with Lauren. Yep, still hot in that dress from this angle. For a second, he wondered what the night would have been like if Alexa wasn't there with him. That was easy, miserable. With her here, though, it had been more than okay. Fun, even, which is the last thing he thought this wedding would be, another drink. Dan plopped down in the seat next to him. What? Oh, yeah, sure. You've got it bad with that one. Nice going. Dan jerked his head in the direction of where Lauren and Alexa had disappeared. Drew had no idea how to respond to that, so he just shrugged and smiled. Yeah, Bill slurred. I'd hit that one. I've always wanted to bang a black girl. What's it like, Drew? Drew didn't realize he'd stood up until he felt Dan pull him in the direction of the bar. He resisted for a second, the rage in his bloodstream pushing him to charge at Bill, but after a second or two he allowed himself to be dragged away. Dan waved at the bartender, who promptly set 2 neat whiskeys at the end of the bar for them. I could throw him off the roof, he said to Dan once he'd calmed down enough to speak. You could, Dan said. And you probably should. But maybe wait until after the wedding? Too many witnesses right now. Drew picked up his drink and looked around the room for Alexa. At least she hadn't heard Bill. All I know is that I'm keeping him the hell away from Alexa for the rest of the night. Lauren ran up to her room to retrieve her lipstick, so Alexa killed some time texting Maddie an update from inside one of the bathroom stalls. All of a sudden, her ears perked up at a conversation by the sinks. I thought Drew was the one to break up with Molly? He was. He totally destroyed her when he did it, too. That was Amy. But I bet he was pissed when Josh and Molly started dating. She laughed. When he gets rid of that date of his, I have an idea for a place he can find someone who looks a lot like Molly. The conversation faded as they left the bathroom. Drew had told her Molly had broken up with him, hadn't he? Had he lied to her, or was she remembering things wrong? 30 seconds later, while looking in the mirror, she got another hit to the psyche. One glance down at her clutch to take out her lipstick, and when she looked back up, she was flanked by thin blonde women, All three of them were in cocktail dresses shorter and tighter than anything she'd dare to wear because of her thighs and hips and butt. Their perky little breasts were obviously unencumbered by bras, and their long, thin legs looked even longer and thinner because of their sky-high heels. And there she was in between them, in the dress that her friends would say made her look voluptuous, which was just another word for fat. She couldn't believe Maddie had convinced her not to wear Spanx. She'd felt great in that dress just a few hours ago when she left Drew's hotel room, but was that just beer and flattering lighting? Maddie had never steered her wrong before, but then Maddie was her friend and loved her. Maddie would give her tough love about many things in life, but she would never say something bad about her body. That was the problem with good friends. They were too damn supportive sometimes, and she'd spent the night falling deeper and deeper in lust with Drew, with those damn tingles every time he touched her, and the whole time he was probably looking at all of those other women, wishing he was with one of them. She needed to shake this off to get through the rest of this night. Pep talk in the hallway time. Okay, Alexa Elizabeth Monroe, she said in her head, none of this matters, remember? You're just here because you told Olivia and Maddie about it before you realized you should back out. You're wearing a great dress, you're drinking some free alcohol and eating good food, and you're going to leave in, she started when she felt a hand on her shoulder mid-mental pep talk. Not Drew's. How was it that she already knew his touch? She shook off that question and turned to find Lauren behind her. There you are. Dan texted me that he and Drew are over at the bar. Let's go find them. They found them at the bar, all right. Drew, Dan, and Amy. Alexa sighed. Maybe she needed another pep talk. Amy's little dig about being too skinny for a dress like Alexa's had already been ringing in her ears, and now she was standing there with her hands all over Drew. The cotton candy pink did look ridiculous on her, at least. Hey, Drew said as Alexa and Lauren approached. He felt like he'd been scanning the room for her for an hour. You guys found us. He stepped away from Amy and put his arm around Alexa's waist. Now are you guys coming? Amy asked. Alexa turned and looked up at him with a question in her eyes. Before he could answer it, Amy grabbed his hand. They're going to cut the cake, remember, she said. Yeah, he remembered. Amy had been bugging him about it for the past 5 minutes. Why he had to stand around and watch two people put a fake cut into a huge cake, he'd never understand. Plus, he'd rather stand over here in the corner with his arm around Alexa's waist. In a second, Amy. We'll meet you over there. Amy huffed and walked away. He turned his full attention back to Alexa. But instead of looking back up at him like he wanted her to do, she stared after Amy with a weird look on her face. Come on, she said. They're cutting the cake. Let's go watch. He reached for her hand as they walked across the ballroom and was glad when she took it. Was she upset about the allergy thing? She barely even glanced at him when she came back from the bathroom. As they stood in the crowd surrounding Josh and Molly, she gripped his hand and stared fixedly ahead with that big smile from before planted firmly on her face. Are we cool? He said in her ear. She jumped. Something occurred to him. Is something wrong? Did Bill say anything to you? She turned to him with her eyebrows raised. Bill? No, why? He looked into her eyes, but she seemed to be genuinely confused. Okay, Bill hadn't gotten to her, and it seemed like no one had told her what Bill had said. Nothing, don't worry about it, he said. It wasn't a big deal. Her eyes didn't move from his face. Fine, he wouldn't have believed himself either. I'll tell you later, he said, wondering if that would work. It didn't. Her laughter had no mirth in it. The crowd around them oohed and awed at the stupid cake. She put her finger on his chin and tilted his head down to be level with her own. It was either something gross about my body or something racist. Which one? She asked around them. People toasted to Josh and Molly. Alexa let go of him and raised her glass. He lifted his by rote and drank. The latter, he said. After a few long moments, she took another sip of her drink. He seemed like that kind of guy, she said. Molly came up to them before he had a chance to apologize for Bill. Drew, Alexa, hi. Alexa, I didn't get a chance to say earlier, you look so beautiful tonight. Molly was red-cheeked and beaming, not quite drunk but definitely tipsy. Drew knew the signs. "Oh, Molly, thank you so much, but you look stunning. That dress is incredible and this wedding has been so lovely." "Thank you so much for welcoming me," Alexa said, squeezing Molly's hand. No one would have been able to tell from the look on her face that they'd just been having a kind of tense conversation. "You are so kind. I'm so delighted that Drew has found you." Molly said. "So was he," he realized. "So am I," he said, and slid his arm around Alexa's waist. She relaxed against him, and he sighed in relief. "Oh, you two are so adorable," Molly said. Okay, maybe she was more on the drunk side of the spectrum. "Anyway, I wanted to let Alexa know that I'm about to throw my bouquet." A look of horror flashed over Alexa's face before she covered it with that now familiar big, bright smile. Big, bright, fake smile, oh. Alexa said to Molly. "Okay, great." Molly hugged both of them again and fluttered to the middle of the dance floor, collecting bridesmaids and female wedding guests as she went. "I guess I should go over there." Alexa drained her champagne glass and handed it to him, but made no move toward the dance floor. "You don't have to sound quite so excited about it." He pushed her in Molly's direction. She rolled her eyes at him, but walked over and joined the gaggle of women in cocktail dresses. Lauren caught her arm and said something that caused Alexa to double over in laughter. He wanted to know what had made her laugh like that and how he could duplicate it. Not only to see that glimpse of her boobs in that red bra, but partly to see that as soon as the bouquet left Molly's hand, Alexa and Lauren took slow, steady steps backward. After a scuffle, one of the bridesmaids triumphantly raised the bouquet, but his eyes were on Alexa, by that time at the far end of the dance floor. He saw Alexa and Lauren turn to each other with identical fake pouts on their faces. This time he was the one who doubled over laughing. Dan nudged him. "Should we be insulted?" Dan gestured in the direction of Lauren and Alexa, clapping and pouting as the bridesmaid waved the bouquet. Drew laughed again. "Nah, I think we should be feeling pretty smug that we're dating the smartest women in the room," Drew told him. Alexa and Lauren had formed a circle with a few other women, all dancing to single ladies with their hands in the air. "Shall we join them?" Alexa danced with Lauren, letting the movement and the laughter shake away her annoying thoughts. When she felt a hand on her waist, she turned to see Drew behind her and laughed again, at how ridiculous the evening had been and how much fun she was suddenly having. He took hold of one of her hands and swung her around to face him and laughed back down at her. Other members of the wedding party joined their group and danced with and around them, but song after song came on, and he never moved from her side. "Water," he said in her ear after they'd been on the dance floor for a long time. "Yes, please." She walked with him over to the bar. She glanced up at the ornate clock over the bar, surprised at how late it had gotten. And how much she didn't want this night to end. Damn it, it had been fun to be Drew's fake girlfriend, but she knew that once the clock struck midnight, so to speak, the fairy tale would be all over. He leaned against the bar, his jacket off, his bow tie untied, a little sweaty and disheveled from dancing. Good Lord, this guy was hot. He rolled up his sleeves, exposing his tan forearms. She wanted to run her fingers up and down them and feel how warm and strong they were. She needed to stop letting her imagination run away with her. She said. "It's getting late, and if I want to make the last BART train back to the East Bay, I should probably leave pretty soon." Why had she said that? Why, when she was standing next to a hot guy, basically panting over him? If she was Maddie, hell, if she was Amy, she would have grabbed one of those hot forearms and wrapped it around her body, letting him know what she wanted without having to say anything. Sadly, she was Alexa, so she would flee instead. He put his water bottle down and looked at her. "Okay." "Okay," she said. Olivia and Maddie would get mad at her for not throwing herself at him, but they didn't understand that she just didn't know how. Plus, rejection from this guy was the last thing her self-esteem needed. Talk about the opposite of getting back on the horse. That would make her avoid horses, and stables, and all farm animals for another few years. So to speak, he stepped closer to her and put his hand on her waist. Her hand landed on his arm, and without even meaning to, she ran her fingers up and down. Oh God, touching him like this was as good as she'd thought it would be, or, he looked straight down into her eyes, you could stay. A question was in his eyes, and a smile hovered over his lips. His thumb drew slow circles on her hip and then moved up her side to her ribs. His other hand moved up to her face and traced the outline of her lips with his fingers. She shivered. He waited, or, she said, I could stay. He pulled her against him and kissed her. Their lips clung together softly at first, then with more urgency. He tasted like bourbon and chocolate cake and everything she'd ever craved. She sighed against his lips and murmured his name, and she could feel his smile. Her hands moved into his hair, that hair that she'd been wanting to touch all night, and he kissed her harder. His hand cupped her cheek, and the gentle touch on her skin as she felt the heat of his mouth had her nerve endings on fire. It seemed like they were all alone in that crowded ballroom. The people and the noise swirled around them as his lips touched hers, his tongue slid inside her mouth, his body pressed up against hers. They pulled apart for a moment, and he smiled down at her. I've been wanting to do that all night, he said, his golden brown eyes staring straight into hers. He kissed her cheek, her ear, her collarbone. His tongue traced her lips before he claimed her mouth again. She moved her hand in between them so she could touch his chest, wishing there was no fabric under her fingers but just his skin. Her touch seemed to alight something in Drew. He moved his hands to her back and tugged her against his body. His hands felt like iron against her back, and his rough touch sent a thrill up and down her spine. She bit his lip in retaliation for the bruises she'd have the next day. He laughed and sucked her lip into his mouth. Sorry for interrupting, Amy said, sounding not at all sorry. They pulled away from each other, both breathing hard. What is it, Amy? Drew didn't look away from Alexa. He looked at her like he wanted to throw her over his shoulder, take her into a dark closet, and screw her senseless. Maybe that was just what she wanted him to do. Molly and Josh are about to leave. You're needed for the pictures. He finally looked in Amy's direction. Alexa tried to step out of the way, but he grabbed her hand, not letting her go. Great, we'll be there in a second, he said. Amy stood there looking from Drew to Alexa for a few seconds before she sighed and stomped away. Drew turned back to her. How about instead of going to take more pictures, we go upstairs right now? Was this really going to happen? She squeezed his hand and let go. Go take the pictures. Patience is a virtue, she said. Stand still. She reached up and rubbed her thumb against his lips and cheek. We can't have you in the wedding pictures with my lipstick all over you. Okay, now you're ready. He grabbed his tux jacket from the chair where he'd abandoned it and walked with her, hand in hand, over to the wedding party. Drew tried to keep Alexa with him, but she pushed him toward the rest of the groomsmen and faded into the background. Tried to take this last set of pictures, to look excited and surprised to see Josh and Molly waving at the crowd, but his eyes kept straying in Alexa's direction. Her hair was disheveled, her lipstick had mostly rubbed off, and she looked so incredible that he wanted to push her against the wall and pull that dress off her shoulders. Amy came up behind him. Can you just, for the next few minutes, pretend that you ever cared about my sister and take a few damn pictures without staring over at what's her face over there? He sighed. As much as he hated to agree with her, Amy had a point. Yeah, okay, fine. He took a deep breath and turned back to the photographer. Without looking at Amy, he said, I did care about your sister, you know. She snorted. You had an interesting way of showing it. She moved closer to him and waved as Josh and Molly left the room. He started to walk away, but the photographers spun in their direction and told them to do something spontaneous. Amy put her arm around his waist and kissed his cheek. He grinned for the camera and hoped it didn't look too much like he was gritting his teeth. He jumped when he felt Amy's hand on his ass. I put my room key in your pocket, Amy whispered in his ear. In case you want to escape that date of yours and compare sisters later. I can promise I'll beat out Molly. I've always been the wild one. That was a new development. He and Alexa had joked about Amy either wanting to kill him or fuck him, but he hadn't really believed it. Apparently, she wanted to do both. Now he was even more grateful that Alexa was there. Because he knew himself, And he knew that if he hadn't met Alexa in that elevator, at this point in the wedding he would be just drunk and impulsive enough to make yet another bad decision. He stepped away from her, and her hand fell. "No, thanks, Amy. You have a great night." He backed away from her and the rest of the wedding party, and turned to find Alexa. She was sitting on one of the couches in the corner with Lauren and Dan, and Bill. That big, fake smile was back, and her legs were crossed tightly. "You're in my seat," he said to Bill with a shooing motion. When Bill didn't get up, he wanted to punch him in the face, but Dan caught his eye. Instead, he reached out a hand for Alexa. She took it and stood up. "I think it's time for us to call it a night, don't you?" he said. He pulled her close, maybe a little closer than necessary. Dan and Lauren stood up, too, and all four of them walked out of the ballroom without another word to Bill. "Did he bother you?" he said to Alexa as soon as they were out of earshot. She shook her head. "He was probably about to, but I had a drink in my hand, and I was not afraid to use it." They'd been speaking quietly, but Lauren turned around at that. "That guy is an asshole." Dan waited for them to catch up, then whispered to Drew, "Did you tell her what he said?" But his whisper was more like a shout. Dan had never been a quiet drunk. "No, but she figured it out," Alexa said. "He tried to talk to me in Japanese." Lauren said, "I'm Korean. Come on." As they waited for the elevator, Drew stood behind Alexa and wrapped his arms around her. She leaned back against him and set one of her hands against his. Every time she touched him seemed like a secret message reminding him of their kiss and what was to come. When an elevator finally came, they stood against the back wall, his arms still around her. Her hair tickled his chin when he bent down to whisper in her ear, "I think this is our elevator." He kissed her softly when she turned her head toward him. "I think so, too." She smiled. "I hope we don't get stuck again," no offense to Dan and Lauren. When the elevator stopped on Drew's floor, Lauren and Alexa hugged. "I don't know what I would have done without you," Alexa said to Lauren. Especially during the bouquet toss. The women waved goodbye as he and Alexa got off the elevator. Drew could still hear Dan's laughter echoing in the elevator as they entered his hotel room. "I really liked Lauren," Alexa said as the room door closed behind them. He didn't give her a chance to say more before his mouth descended on hers. He pushed her up against the door and boxed her in with his arms. Her hands tangled in his hair and pulled him closer. She pushed his jacket off his shoulders, ripped his shirt out of his pants, and slid her hands up and down his chest. He moved down to her neck, licking and sucking until she wrapped one leg around his waist and pulled him flush against her body. Just kissing this woman was the best thing he'd done all month. He pushed one strap of her dress off her shoulder and bent down to kiss the curve of her breast. "I've been wanting to do that all night," he said. "I've been wanting you to do that all night," she said. Her head was back against the door, and her eyes were closed. She stroked his hair, scraping his scalp with her fingernails in a way that made him shiver. He pushed the other strap down and the dress with it until it hung to her waist. Good Lord. He stared at the red lace of her bra, and what was underneath it. That's a nice reaction. Her hands drifted to his waist, and her fingers moved against his skin. As he stared, unmoving, she reached up to unbutton his shirt. After she'd unfastened 2 buttons, he growled and pulled the whole thing off over his head. She tried to reach for him again, but he pinned her arms against the wall, holding both of her wrists with one hand. "Tell me," he said to her. "Tell me what you want." She hesitated, her eyes half-lidded and hazy. "Do you want this, Alexa?" he asked, his free hand moving up and down her torso. "You know I do," she said, her eyes closed. She pushed her chest against him, but he kept his touch gentle. He could sense her frustration. He loved it. "Then tell me what you want me to do to you." Finally, she opened her eyes wide and smiled at him. "Kiss me." She didn't specify exactly where she wanted him to kiss her. Oh my God, Drew. But she hadn't seemed to mind the place he chose. "We've got to get you on that bed." He picked her up by the waist, took 3 steps across the room, and tossed her on the bed. She laughed as she landed on the pile of pillows. He took a flying leap and landed next to her. He rolled on top of her as they laughed together. He tickled her, and she giggled as she tickled him back. "This dress has to come off," he said, tugging at the hem, these pants first. She reached for his waistband. He sat back and watched her unbutton and unzip him. The sight of her, dress half off, lips swollen and bitten, hands on him, made him grin at his own good fortune. She grinned back at him, grabbed him by the hair, pulled him down to her, and kissed him. He relished the feel of her body under him, her softness against his hardness, her hands in his hair and rubbing up and down his back. After a long while, he pulled back again and looked down at her half-naked body. "I really need to get this dress off you," he said. She pushed the dress off her hips and threw it onto the floor. He saw a flash of red underwear as she lay back against the pillows. Drew rolled her underneath him and moved his hands to her breasts. Alexa let her eyes flutter closed, enjoying the sensation as his fingers caressed the underside of her breasts and moved upward. But then his hands stopped moving. She opened her eyes, and he looked straight back at her, that small smile on his face. "Tell me," he said again. She wiggled underneath him, willing him to start moving again, but it didn't work. He seemed to enjoy frustrating her. Luckily, he was really hot while he was doing it to Alexa. He ran his hands through her hair, then down the sides of her face once, twice. "Tell me. You know I want to hear you say it." She took a deep breath and reminded herself that it was just one night, that she didn't need to be embarrassed. She took his hand in hers and moved it to where she wanted it. "Kiss me?" It had worked so well the first time. He smiled and bent down to her. "That's a start," he said. "Oh wow." Making out with him in bed was even better than it had been against the door. Now he knew what she liked, the moves that made her moan and gasp and sink her fingers into his shoulders. He sat up and smiled down at her, his eyes on her bright red panties. She mentally thanked Maddie for ordering her to wear a matching bra and panty set. Then all thoughts of Maddie and anyone else left her mind. He moved like a flash down her body, pulling those panties off as he went and throwing them across the room. And then he set about doing things to her with his fingers and his mouth that almost made her black out. After she collapsed against the pillows, he lifted himself off her, a smug smile on his face. Not that she blamed him. He had every right to be proud of himself after that. He trailed kisses up her body, on her stomach, her breasts, her neck, until he finally dropped a light kiss on her mouth and rolled over next to her. She turned to face him. She moved her hand to his side and felt the hardness of his chest and the trail of hair that disappeared into his waistband. Holy shit, this guy was something else. That was, she tried to think of something to describe what that had been like, and failed. That made me incoherent. I can see that. He leaned forward and kissed her, harder this time. I liked it. She tugged at the waistband of his boxer briefs. "These have got to come off," she said. "And something else has to come on." Not going to argue with that. He pushed himself off the bed, pulled his underwear off, and dug into his bag, coming up a few seconds later with a box of condoms. "This what you were referring to?" he asked. He got back on the bed before she had a chance to admire his naked body. He didn't move from her side and looked over at her. "Yeah," she said. That seemed to be what he was waiting for. A half-second later, she was on her back. She laughed up at him, and he grinned down at her, and then wiped the smile from his face. "This is not a laughing matter. We have serious work to do." Alexa tried to stop smiling, but her lips curved up despite herself. Well, never let it be said that Alexa Monroe doesn't believe in the value of hard work. He ran his hands up and down her hips, and pushed her knees open. "I would never say that." Minutes or hours later, he collapsed on top of her. "Good God," he said. "Why haven't we been doing this since 30 seconds after that elevator got stuck?" "We are apparently both very stupid people," she said in his ear. "Very, very stupid," he said. They stayed like that for a few seconds, both trying to catch their breath. Eventually he reached down, pulled the condom off, and rolled over onto his back, pulling her with him. Her head was on his chest, her legs splayed on either side of his. She could be happy just like this for the next few weeks. Maybe months. What was it about this guy? Every other first time she'd had sex with someone, and often the second and third and fourth time, she had worried about how he'd felt about her body, or if he was really attracted to her or not. Or if he really liked her boobs or would rather they be smaller or perkier, or some other niggling anxiety that had prevented her from really relaxing and enjoying herself. She'd always enjoyed herself but was still self-conscious, never quite wanting to do certain positions because of how her stomach or her butt would look or what he would see. And she'd certainly never been able to say what she wanted out loud, never at first, sometimes never at all, but with Drew, she'd been able to throw herself into the whole experience from the first kiss. She'd even thrown her clothes off without worrying about what he would think and how he would react to her body. Good Lord, was this what one-night stands were like? Maybe it was because she was never going to see this guy again after she left the hotel in the morning. They barely knew each other, they'd met 2 days before, and he lived in LA, for Christ's sake. She could be completely honest, she could totally enjoy herself, with no repercussions, no regrets. That must be it. Whatever the reason, it had been pretty damn great. That was, he caressed her back and kissed her shoulder instead of finishing his sentence. She said, sleepy? He kissed her cheek. I can barely move, she said against his chest. My limbs all feel like they're made out of melted butter. He chuckled and she felt his chest rumble underneath her face. Hold that thought for 1 minute. He turned her over and got out of the bed. After a trip to the bathroom, he slid back in next to her, tucked the covers over both of them, and pulled her close. Good night, Alexa. He wrapped her up in his arms. She ran her hands up and down his arms and relaxed against his body. Night, Drew. She woke up a few hours later, her back pressed against his chest, his arms circling her. She felt like she was in a snug, warm, masculine cocoon. She had never realized how much that was the ideal place for her until just that moment. There was just one problem, she had to pee. Okay, Alexa. Just don't think about it. Just lie here and be content in this cozy sleeping bag of pure male goodness and let that lull you back to sleep. She listened to his even breathing, felt his chest move against her back and the prickle of the hair on his legs rubbing against hers, and smiled. She could do this, her bladder disagreed. It increased the pressure and reminded her of all of that champagne she'd drunk and those bottles of water that had closed out the night. Oh God, she really had to pee. No, Alexa. Just stay here. Go back to sleep. Don't think about anything liquid. You can do it. Enjoy this perfect moment. She took a deep breath, clenched everything, and tried to relax against him again, reaching back to that voice in her brain for a pep talk. Have to pee, I have to pee, I have to pee. When even her internal monologue had abandoned the cause, she gave in. She slowly moved out of the circle of his arms in an attempt to not wake him up, pulled back the sheet, and tiptoed into the bathroom. They hadn't closed the curtains, apparently, they'd been preoccupied, so light shone into the room from the lit-up skyline. That gave her enough light to get from the bathroom to the bed without tripping over the shoes, clothes, and underwear littering the floor. She got into the warm bed, trying to figure out how she could get back to her perfect cocoon from earlier. He was still on his side, but his arms were folded now. She couldn't very well push herself back against his chest and wrap his arms back around herself. Could she? Well, she could, but not without waking him up. She decided after thinking about it for a few seconds. She lay down on her pillow and admired his naked chest, hoping that maybe he would roll over to her in his sleep and she would get to finish her night off with his arms and legs draped around her again. You going to come back over here or are you going to leave me cold and lonely for the rest of the night? He asked, his eyes still closed. I thought you were asleep. She scooted closer, and he wrapped his arms back around her. I didn't want to wake you up. He leaned down to kiss her, and their lips clung together. She really liked kissing this guy. Even if you had woken me up, he said, I wouldn't have minded. Something inside of her melted. At his words, his smile, his touch. She stroked his stubbly cheek and pulled his head back down toward hers. They kissed again, longer, slower. The urgency of earlier in the night had disappeared. They kissed like they had days, weeks, years to do nothing but lie in this bed and explore each other. His fingers moved from her back to her neck, then to her hair. His lips touched her cheeks, her eyelids, and the tip of her nose, which surprised a giggle out of her. Not content to be passive, her hands ran down his chest, dancing over his nipples, pressing into his muscles, squeezing his hips. When her fingers lingered there, he said, "Aren't you going to keep going?" At this moment, in this hotel room, this night, she would do whatever he wanted her to do. She slid down his body to where she knew he wanted her to go. "I really like the way you do that," he said afterward, once he got his breath back. She crawled up from the bottom of the bed and collapsed on top of him. After a few minutes, she started to roll off to the side. He stopped her. "Where exactly do you think you're going?" His hands were on both sides of her waist, holding her in place. "Oh." She tried to think of a good way to say it and gave up. "I thought I might be too heavy, so I was going to." His hands gripped her tighter. "No, you're perfect. Don't go anywhere." He pulled her against him, but relaxed his hold almost right away. "Unless you wanted to move? Because if so, I don't want you to." "No." She tilted her head back so she could see his face. "I'm happy right here." He wrapped his arms around her again, and she leaned her head against his chest. "Good," he said. "So am I." Drew woke up the next morning with Alexa's body flush against his leg draped over her hip, and her hands on his butt. What a fucking fantastic way to wake up. He thought about letting her stay asleep, he really did. But then he remembered that he was leaving in a few hours. He needed to get all of this woman he could. He ran his fingers up and down her body. My God, her skin was so smooth. He pulled down the covers and looked at those breasts that made him salivate. If he remembered last night correctly, which he thought he did, she really liked it when he played with her breasts. As soon as he squeezed, she opened her eyes and smiled. What a nice way to wake up," she said. "I thought you might think that." After round 3, or was it 2.5, they curled up together in bed breathing hard. "What time is it?" she said into the pillow. He lifted himself up and looked at the bedside clock. "Just after 9. She snuggled against him. "Hey, Drew?" He grinned. "I just met you 2 days ago. So how do I already know that that's your I want something voice? Haven't I done enough for you this morning?" He asked the top of her head. He felt her smile against his chest. You definitely have done quite a lot. But you know what else you could do?" He put a hand over hers, trapping it where he loved to feel it. "Keep doing that and I'll do whatever you want." She laughed and kissed his shoulder. "Does that mean you'll call down to room service and order me coffee?" He flipped her on her back and pressed her against the bed as she smiled up at him. Her hair was wild, she had makeup smudges around her eyes, and he wanted to keep her in this bed all day. "Coffee," he said, a fake tone of incredulity in his voice. "I got the I need a favor voice for coffee? Are you that easily pleased, or do you love coffee that much?" Still on top of her, he reached for the bedside phone and dialed room service. "At this point, I think you know how easily pleased I am," she said as her fingers walked down his body. He played with her nipple again as he placed a very large room service order. She sighed and moved beneath him while he was on the phone. If they hadn't just had sex, he'd be grabbing a condom just from watching her do that. When he hung up and pulled her back into his arms, he wasn't quite ready for round 4, but he was pretty happy to think about getting there soon. Hold that thought. He rolled off the bed and into the bathroom. When he came back into the room, he hunted for his wallet so he could tip room service when it arrived. He found it in the back pocket of his pants, along with a stray room key. "Oh my God, I forgot to tell you, Amy slipped me her room key last night." "What?" She sat up straight. He plopped on the bed next to her. "Yeah, I know, right? She said something shitty about you and then something shitty about Molly and then slid her key into my pocket." Wow. Her smile faded for the first time in hours. He wasn't sure why, but he wanted to make her laugh again. "So I guess you were right, about her either wanting to kill me or fuck me, though I'm still not sure which one." It worked, for a second. But after her laughter subsided, that thoughtful expression came back. "So, last night at one point I was in the bathroom." She paused. "Yeah? Was she going to tell him about people having sex in the bathroom? That would start round 4 off with a bang. No one knew I was in there." "Oh good, this was getting even better. And I heard Amy tell someone about when you broke up with Molly? Am I remembering incorrectly, or did you imply that it was the other way around?" Oh shit. His hand dropped. After he didn't say anything for a while, Alexa pulled the sheet up to her neck. That did not seem like a good sign for round 4, so I guess that means I wasn't remembering incorrectly. He sat up and sighed. Why was it just too much to ask for him to get through this weekend without having to talk about this? Yeah, I broke up with Molly. Yeah, I implied that it was the other way around to you. I don't know why. She sat there for a while looking at him, her knees drawn up and her hands clasped. Guess he could wave goodbye to round 4. Oh, the hell with it, fine, I do know why, because I was an asshole to Molly, and I don't like telling people, especially the cute women kinds of people I'm trapped in elevators with, that I was an asshole to a good person. The tight grip of her hands relaxed, and she touched his arm, just for a second. Okay, she said. Thank you for being honest and not bullshitting me right there. He shrugged, looking at his knees instead of her. He might as well tell her this whole story now. Molly and I dated for about a year and a half. She's a very nice person, as you probably noticed. He could see her nod out of the corner of his eye. And I really cared about her. I maybe even loved her. I'm not sure if I was in love with her, but I think I loved her. If that makes sense. She nodded again, and her hand went back to his arm, staying there this time. Right before her birthday, I overheard her on the phone talking to one of her friends. She thought I was planning to propose and was all excited about it. He was still staring at his knees. He had a scar on his right knee from that fall he took while running a few months back. He would be happy to tell her that story instead of this one. He took a deep breath. I pretty much panicked. I wasn't ready for that. I definitely hadn't been planning to propose, and now I didn't want to deal with her disappointment when I didn't. So of course, like an asshole, the next day I told her I didn't think it was working out and broke up with her. Right before her birthday. And then I dated 3 other people in the med school in quick succession. Kind of a jerk move. Her hand moved up his arm to his. He grabbed it and held on. Molly had hated him after that. Hell, he'd hated himself. She'd forgiven him eventually, because she was Molly and, he strongly suspected, because Josh had gone to bat for him. Which is why he was at the wedding in the first place, and the whole Josh thing, she asked, they didn't start dating right away. In fact, they didn't start dating for well over a year. But I still felt betrayed when they did, even though I had no right to feel that way. And even though Josh asked me if it would be okay. I guess I felt like, when I was ready to get married, Molly would be around for that. He sighed and let go of her hand. Anyway, we dated. I was an asshole. Eventually I apologized for being such an asshole. Josh is a great guy. Last night she married him. There, the whole story, more or less. She tightened the sheet around her body and turned to him. So, this wedding was kind of your penance, then, she asked him. He leaned against one of the pillows they'd pushed out of the way during the night and finally met her eyes. I guess so, he said. Maybe that's one reason why I was dreading it so much. And why I needed a sandwich so badly. He hoped that she'd laugh at that, but she didn't. She didn't even meet his eyes. Oh hey. He touched her arm. I'm sorry. I should have been honest with you before you came here last night, and not just because you found out somewhere else. She met his eyes and nodded. Okay, was all she said. Are you mad? He asked. He didn't want to push this. And he definitely didn't want to keep talking about it. But he didn't want her to be mad at him. They only had a little while left. I'm not mad, she said. She looked at him for a minute, and her smile became more of a real one. I did find out last night, you know. If I was mad, I wouldn't be here right now. He shouldn't ask. He really shouldn't. She'd think that's why he apologized, and it wasn't. But he couldn't help himself. Does this mean there's a possibility for round 4? He asked, and he reached for the sheet she'd used to cover herself up. She looked down at his hand on the sheet and met his eyes. 3.5, you mean? He pulled the sheet covering her torso down and drew his thumb over her breasts. Her eyes followed his thumb as it stroked her body. I guess that means that I have some work to do, he said. He pushed her back down on the bed as she laughed. As they kissed, His fingers played with her nipples in the way that he now knew she liked. When his lips trailed down to her breasts, her fingernails dug into his back. Did she know that he liked that? He hoped so. He'd make sure to tell her in a second. He drew a nipple into his mouth, and room service. Came the call from outside. She groaned and covered her face with her arm. Hey, he said as he stood up. You're the one who insisted on coffee. She sighed dramatically and he laughed. Don't remind me. She got out of bed, too. I'm going to the bathroom. The room service guy doesn't need to see me naked, even if it's under a sheet. Once she was safely in the bathroom, he let the room service guy in and tipped him well. While the guy set up the tray on the bed, Drew double-checked what time his flight was. Noon. Which meant he'd have to leave for the airport in, like, 30 minutes, damn it. It wasn't enough time, but there were a ton of flights from San Francisco to LA every day. Is the coast clear? She shouted from the bathroom after the door closed behind room service. He laughed. You can come out now. When was the last time he'd laughed this much? He'd been laughing with her ever since that first moment in the elevator. She padded out of the bathroom, wrapped in a towel this time, and took a big sniff of the air. Coffee. She got back in bed and poured herself a cup from the carafe on the tray. I'll be right back. He disappeared into the bathroom, his phone still in his hand. In few clicks, he changed his flight to the one at 8 that night. Now he could relax. He came back out of the bathroom, not covered in a towel, and was pleased to see her eyes follow him as he crossed to the bed. I thought you were going to start flexing any second, she said as he climbed into bed next to her and reached for his own coffee cup. He pulled his hand back, met her eyes, and slowly made a fist. She laughed at him but bent over and kissed his bicep. I poured you coffee, she said, sipping her own. But I didn't know how you take it. He poured half the container of cream into his coffee and shook in few sugar packets. She looked from the pale brown liquid in his mug to the unadulterated blackness of her own and laughed. I would make a I like my coffee the way I like my men joke, but it would be either inaccurate or just really dirty. He put his arm up next to her mug, pretending to be injured. What, I'm not black enough for you, he asked. She put her arm up next to his mug. Sweetheart, it seems like I'm too black for you, she said. His coffee was paler than her skin color. She was right. Oops. Somehow that didn't seem like the right observation to make. I didn't mean. I wasn't trying to. He looked from his cup to her, covered up by the white sheets again, and back to his cup. Everything he could think of to say sounded like a terrible idea. She turned his face toward hers, forcing him to look her in the eye. Stop. It's okay. I was just joking. He saw the smile on her face and relaxed. Now, she said, uncovering the room service plates, let's eat some bacon so we're all fortified for round 3.5. Afterward, they lay curved around each other in bed again, his head on her chest, her fingers drifting through his hair. Drew, she said eventually. When do we have to get out of here? What time is your flight? Not until 8 tonight. Hopefully, she wouldn't ask why he was leaving so late. If she did, he could make up something. I have to check out in. He glanced at the clock by the bed. 20 minutes, though. So, if you aren't busy for the rest of the day, we could hang out. We'll have to get out of here, but we can go somewhere else. Eat tacos, relax in the park, go for a walk, I don't know. Or go back to her place, maybe? I mean, unless you're busy. You probably have a work thing to do, or something, so no worries if you do. He was rambling, but he couldn't help it. Why didn't it occur to him when he changed his flight that she might have something else to do today? Now, not only was he going to have to say goodbye to her very soon, but he would then have to wander around San Francisco alone for the rest of the day. He was so preemptively annoyed that he almost missed her response. Sure, why not? Let me jump in the shower. Alexa grinned at her reflection in the bathroom mirror. How exactly was this happening to her? Not only had she had crazy, dirty, great sex all night with a really hot guy, but said hot guy wanted to spend the day with her? For once, she was going to ignore all the work she had to do today. Thank God she'd gotten ready in his room yesterday. so she had her hair stuff and something to wear other than a cocktail dress. As they loaded their bags into his rental car, she mused over the past 2 days, all of which the Alexa of Thursday afternoon would have never believed. Hell, the Alexa of 9 a.m. Sunday wouldn't have believed she'd still be with him at noon. The sex had been great, really great, and he'd made it pretty clear that he'd thought so, too. But she had figured he'd want to get out of the hotel as soon as he could on Sunday and leave all of the reminders of the wedding behind. Including her, she shrugged. He had a late flight back to LA and needed something to occupy his time, and she was around and available. It wasn't any more than that. She probably shouldn't have jumped so quickly when he asked her if she could hang out today, but she couldn't fool herself. She didn't want this weekend to end yet. At this point, when he said jump, she'd ask how high she could hate herself for that on Monday. Sunday was all his. "Didn't you just eat a bushel of bacon?" she asked him as he drove toward the mission. "You're really ready for a burrito already?" "Number 1, I worked off that bacon, as you well know," he said. He grinned at her, and she grinned right back. "Number 2, I'm not quite ready for a burrito yet, but I know that I will be soon, so we might as well get them and find a good spot in Dolores Park. It's already nice and sunny, and it'll get busy." She watched his profile as he drove, a little sad he had shaved that day. His smooth skin was nice against her face, but just the thought of the feel of his stubble last night on her cheeks, her lips, and her thighs made her shift in her set. "You used to live in the Bay Area?" she asked. He'd mentioned something about that to one of the wedding guests the night before. She'd nodded and smiled along like she already knew his whole life story, but now she actually got to ask questions. "Yeah, had a fellowship for 2 years at Children's Hospital in Oakland. I loved it. Great hospital." He glanced to his right as he went to turn and slid his hand onto her leg. She hoped he left it there for a while. Why pediatrics? Apparently, now she couldn't stop asking questions. He shrugged and laughed. "Is it corny to say because I like kids? But it's because I like kids. I thought I was going to be a regular surgeon when I started med school, actually. But I did a pediatric surgery rotation, and it was just so much more fun. The doctors were great, the kids cracked me up, there were always toys around." She laughed and touched his hand to interrupt him. "You picked your specialty because of all of the toys?" "Figures." He turned his hand over and held on to hers. "See, I knew you would make fun of me. Tell the truth, if you had to choose between 2 jobs, one with toys all over the place and one without, which one would you pick?" She thought about it for a second, and he squeezed her hand. "See?" He flicked on the blinker, waiting out the people behind him also vying for the parking spot he'd found. "So, what does a mayor's chief of staff actually do?" "Everything, really." They got out of the car and into the line outside of La Taqueria. "Manage everything day to day, supervise a lot of different departments, stay on top of major events going on around the city and the Bay Area, crisis management, policy, and on and on." When they got to the front of the line, they ordered carnitas for him, al pastor for her, and guacamole and salsa and chips for both of them. He won the fight for the bill. "How did you get a job like that?" They stood in the corner while they waited for their food, his arm around her waist, her body snug against his. "I'll get used to this, Alexa," she reminded herself. She almost pulled away from him but decided to hell with that. She had 6 hours left with this guy. She might as well enjoy it while it lasted. "I worked in the city attorney's office 1 semester in law school, and I really liked it. You got to do a little bit of everything, but you still felt like you were doing something for the public good. After law school, I managed to get a job there full-time. A few years ago, the old mayor retired, and my boss, then the city attorney, decided to run for the job. When he won, he made me his chief. I'm kind of young for this job. It probably should have gone to someone older and more experienced. But you wanted it more," he said. She smiled at him. "I did want it more. I worked damn hard for it, too." She tucked their burritos and chips in her tote bag and they left the taqueria. "You want to walk or drive to the park?" he asked. "Walk. We can't count on getting another parking space." This isn't like LA, you know. There isn't going to be a valet up there for us. He took her hand as they turned up the street. Oh, I guess we'll have to see if my slow Los Angeles legs are up to walking up these great big San Francisco hills. She laughed at him. As they walked the mile to the park, they talked the whole way about their jobs and what they liked most about them, their daily aggravations, their stress relievers. The park was crowded, but they found a spot in a sunny corner. He reached inside her tote bag and pulled out a towel for them to lie on. Where did that come from? She asked, looking from her bag to the towel and back at him. He flopped down onto the towel and gestured for her to sit next to him. She stood there looking down at him, the bag of burritos in her arms, not moving. A genie put it there. He tried. She raised her eyebrows. It was a gift from the hotel? An apology for the stuck elevator? She pursed her lips. Okay, fine, I took it, but it should have been an apology for the stuck elevator. We needed something to sit on. What did you want me to do? Take the sheets? Alexa gave in and sat down next to him. She handed him the bag of burritos and cracked open her Mexican Coke. For the record, just because I sat here doesn't mean I condone this theft. I'm a public servant, after all. He laughed and reached for his burrito. They ate their burritos in silence and watched the people go by. Dolores Park on a sunny day in San Francisco was like a public party, everyone coming out to enjoy the brief escape from the fog bank. There were groups of shirtless men drinking beer, women in sundresses eating ice cream cones, tech brothers in .com t-shirts and baseball caps checking out the women in sundresses, multiracial families pushing strollers on their way to the playground, teenagers on skateboards, solitary people with books, show and hot dog and coffee vendors, old men chatting together in Spanish or Russian, the scent of weed wafting in their direction every 5 minutes. Alexa wrapped up the second half of her burrito, kicked off her sandals, and lay back. She could feel the grass under her toes and the sun on her face. A few minutes later, she felt Drew lie down next to her. Not quite touching her, but almost. I should check my email. She made no move to do so. What she really wanted to do was reach for his hand, but now that they were out of the hotel room, and the hotel room bed, she had lost some of her nerve. That was a couple-why thing to do, and despite everything that had happened this weekend, the two of them were not a couple. They both knew that they were only together right now because he had time to kill before his flight. And she knew she was there because she didn't want the weekend with him to end yet. He picked up her purse and moved it to his other side, out of her reach. No checking email, he said. You're here with me now, no email, no phones, no checking in with your boss. He put his hands behind his head and gave her that smug and, okay, fine, sexy grin. Damn it if she wouldn't do anything to make him keep grinning at her like that. But she'd felt her phone vibrate a few times through her tote bag as they walked to the park. She really should check. She looked around, grateful that they were behind a tree for what she was about to do. She rolled on top of him so she could reach into her purse for her phone. Just when she was about to roll back off, his hands came around her waist and held her in place. His face was so close to hers. This smile was really all for her. Not for show, or for photos, or to convince her to be his date, or to sleep with him. It was just for her. Alexa, right now, in this moment. Oh, you think you can distract me with your body so you can get to your phone, do you? She moved, not really trying to get away, just seeing what he would do. His hands tightened on her hips. Well, you're right about that. You don't play fair, Monroe. She grinned and pushed away from him for real. He released her but kept his arm around her as she lay on her side next to him and checked her phone, her head on his chest. She ignored the texts from Maddie, no way she could answer them with him right there, and went straight to the emails from Theo and a deputy city attorney. She emailed Theo back a quick answer but paused to think for a while about the other email. She finally suggested that they meet on Monday afternoon. Some conversations were easier in person than in text. When she looked up, Drew was looking down at her, no longer smiling. Everything okay there? Or do you have to go? He asked. She moved away from the curve of his arm and sat up, and he let her go. Why do you ask? Did he want her to go? Did he want her to say, yeah? As a matter of fact, My boss has a public park-related crisis. I need to rush back to Berkeley immediately. It was nice knowing you. Was he tired of dealing with her and her wide hips and all of her talk about her job, and was he ready to go home to LA and leave this weekend behind? He sat up. Too, you were frowning at your phone. I thought something might be wrong. Oh, the hell with it. She might as well take one more risk this weekend. No, I don't have to go, she said. She paused and looked down. Unless, you're ready to go? No, he answered immediately. She looked up at him, and his smile was tentative now. I don't want either of us to go anywhere. When Alexa smiled at him, relief shot through Drew's bloodstream. She lay back down on the towel, and Drew lay down next to her, facing her. They moved the conversation away from the big topics of jobs and weddings and ex-girlfriends. Instead, they made up pretend conversations for the people around them, fed leftover tortilla chips to a friendly puppy who came by with his owner, and tried not to laugh when a teenage skateboarder attempted to fly down the church steps across the way and fell. "Shh," he said when she couldn't hold it in anymore. "You'll hurt his pride." She giggled, and he giggled with her, and suddenly they were laughing so hard they couldn't breathe. At the delight of watching someone fall down, at the joy that they'd both found it so funny, at the pleasure of being together in the sun, enjoying each other's company so much. He didn't even realize when it happened, but somehow his arms were around her and her head was against his chest as they shook with laughter. When their laughter finally slowed, and then stopped, he looked down at her. Her cheeks were pink from the laughter and the sun, her hair was tousled, and her eyes glowed. Without even thinking about it, he leaned down and kissed her. He hadn't kissed her since they'd left the hotel room. He didn't know why. Was he nervous to do it in public? Did they have some sort of tacit agreement that all of that had been left behind in room 1624 of the Fairmont? Whatever the reason, it was clearly a stupid one, because as soon as he kissed her, he wondered why he'd spent all of this time with her today without his hands and lips on her. They lay there in the sun, kissing lazily. He touched her like she was made out of precious china, like he couldn't grab too hard or make any sudden movements. He wanted to throw his leg over her body again, wanted to push her over and roll on top of her, but they were outside in full view of hundreds of people, and she was a public servant, after all. So instead, he kept up the long, slow kisses, the gentle touches on her arm, her neck, her back, and hoped she was as frustrated as he was. Eventually, she pulled away and rested her head on his chest. He wrote his name on the small of her back with his thumb. "What time is it?" she asked him. "After 5, he said after checking his phone. "Too late, you know." He'd just realized something. "My flight is out of the Oakland airport, so I can drop you off at home in Berkeley on the way to the airport. If you want, I mean." She lifted her head. "Are you sure? Sure that my flight is from Oakland, or that I can take you home?" "Either way, the answer is yes." She pulled his head down to hers and kissed him again. "That sounds great," she said, and rested her head back on his chest. "Do you want to get some ice cream on the way back to the car?" she asked him a few minutes later, her voice muffled, her hand on the bare skin of his hip, right above the waistband of his jeans. What does ice cream mean exactly in this context? He pulled back to see her face, to check if he made her smile. He did. "I mean ice cream, ice cream." She pinched him, and he laughed. "There's a great place right down the hill." Sure. He was willing to go wherever she wanted. "Let's go get ice cream." She hooked her finger under his chin, pulled him down to her for another kiss, and stood up. After they tucked the towel back into her purse and tossed the remnants of their burritos, they walked back down the hill hand in hand to stand in line for ice cream. "What's good here?" he asked her. The burrito had been hours ago at this point, and all of the ice cream flavors looked great to him. "Well, my favorite is the salted caramel, but I also love the coffee toffee. And I always love cookies and cream." She was so animated when she talked about the ice cream that it made him excited about what was coming next. She was like that about everything she cared about, it seemed. He wondered how she would talk about him. He moved closer to her and hoped their closeness had the same effect on her as it did on him. She shivered. He smiled. All of those sound great, he said. The line ahead of them moved, and they moved up. He stood behind her and massaged her neck. She sighed and leaned back against him. Why, exactly, did you wait until now to let me know you could do that? You could have been doing that this whole time? I didn't mean to hold out on you, he said. He ran his thumb down the middle of her neck, and she let out a low moan. We were a little busy with other things, you know. He kissed her bare shoulder. Next customer in line. The ice cream lady shouted at them, salted caramel in a cone. Please, Alexa said. And you, the woman behind the counter said to him as she packed ice cream into a waffle cone. He'd stared at the menu all that time they'd been in line, but he'd been distracted by Alexa's closeness and had barely paid attention. Cookies and cream? They walked slowly back to the car after they got their ice cream, sharing bites with each other. He drove them across the bridge and followed her directions to a side street off Alcatraz Avenue. The conversation stalled as they got closer and closer to her house. He looked down and saw her hands clasped together, her nails digging into her knuckles. So, this is me. She pointed at a little yellow house. He pulled up in a spot in front of it and hesitated for a second before he turned off the car and got out. He pulled her bag out of the trunk and walked up to her front door. She unlocked the door, and he followed her inside. They walked through a long hallway covered in photographs and into a big living room. A plush yellow sofa lined one wall, covered with bright cushions. It was flanked by fat red chairs and faced a big wall-mounted TV. Magazines and nail polish covered the coffee table, and overstuffed bookshelves lined the walls. It suited her. Bright, attractive, warm. He wanted to flop down on that couch and curl up with her. Where should I put this? He asked, gesturing to the bag. Oh. She paused. Her eyes darted from her bag to his face, then back to her bag. My bedroom is easiest, probably. The afternoon light streamed into her bedroom and lit up the pale yellow walls, the big unmade bed with its green and white striped comforter, the vase full of drooping daffodils on the low bookshelf. He dropped the bag on the floor and turned to her. She had that big smile back on her face. The fake one she'd given Amy and Bill. I had a great time this weekend, she said. Even though he knew she'd had a great time, that smile made him unsure. Screw it. He cleared the 2 feet separating them in one step and pinned her against the wall. Her arms went around his neck, pulling him even closer to her. I know you did, he said. And you know I did, too. He slid one hand up her body and enjoyed her sharp intake of breath when he got to that spot she liked. Her lips parted and her eyes followed his hand. He pulled her dress and bra down. He needed to touch her, without anything in between them. Her fingers tightened on his shoulders. Oh yeah, he knew she'd had a great time this weekend. Don't you have to go to the airport? Her voice was hoarse. I'll drive fast, he said. The hand that wasn't on her breast skimmed her knee and slid up her thigh under her dress. He kept going up, and then stopped, surprised. Have you been walking around all day with no panties on like this? Without waiting for an answer, he pressed a finger inside of her and she cried out. She leaned her head back against the wall and closed her eyes. Tell me, Alexa, he said. She kept making those noises that he couldn't get enough of. Have you been like this all day without telling me? When we were in the park, lying in the grass, could I have done this as easily then? She opened her eyes a sliver and smiled at him. I didn't, she gasped, pack extra panties yesterday. I didn't know I was going to sleep over. What was I supposed to do?